You were a young woman, bound in linen, the scent of myrrh and sweat clinging to the air of a chamber deep beneath Thebes. The Nile's moonlight never reaches here. Gold flickers across the walls, but it is not freedom. It is a gilded cage. The floor beneath you is cool stone, polished by centuries of footsteps that once trembled the same way yours do now. Somewhere behind the carved pillars, a scribe whispers to another, counting softly as your number is marked into the record. The drums begin again, slow, deliberate, ritualistic. Their sound seems to measure your heartbeat, binding you to the rhythm of something ancient and unrelenting. A hand adjusts the oil lamp, and shadows stretch like serpents over the faces of the women beside you, each waiting for the door to open, each trying to understand what will happen once it does. Then the realization comes. This isn't a temple of worship, it's a selection chamber. And the man whose shadow will soon fall across you is not a priest, but a pharaoh who claims to be divine. And yet, above these buried halls, the empire shimmered. A civilization that claimed divine order, even as it hid its darkest devotions in the shadows of its pyramids. If this glimpse into forgotten Egypt unsettles you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Your curiosity fuels our descent into the archives. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive the centuries. Egypt's golden dynasties spanned over 3 millennia, ruling from the fertile floodplains of the Nile to the deserts beyond Nubia. Their monuments reached the heavens, their gods commanded the stars, and their bureaucracy recorded everything. Among those records lies mention of a place rarely spoken of, yet meticulously maintained, Per-Kheneret, the House of Women. It was not myth. It was an institution, funded, regulated, and documented in the temple ledgers of Thebes and Memphis. The language of divinity cloaked its horror: sacred service, ritual purity, divine offering. But what those words truly meant was something far darker. These were not acts of faith. They were acts of control, systematic, deliberate, and sanctioned by the throne itself. The records of Egypt's splendor, the golden masks, the temples of Karnak, the tombs carved in eternal silence, were not written by the women who served in the shadows. Their histories are scattered across fragments of papyrus, broken statues, and the margins of state ledgers. They do not speak of conquest or glory, but of the systematic conversion of human intimacy into an instrument of control. What the poets celebrated as the pharaoh's divine household was, in truth, a machine that consumed thousands of lives every generation, a system so efficient, so coldly bureaucratic that even the gods themselves seemed to look away. Every conquest fed it. When Nubian villages were razed or Levantine caravans captured, the spoils were divided not only in gold and grain, but in bodies. Women and children were herded into public squares where royal scribes conducted what they called the purification. To the crowds it looked like a ritual, but it was bookkeeping, columns of numbers inked beside each trembling figure: age, skin tone, health, teeth, fertility potential. Some chroniclers described Pharaoh's officials sorting them beneath painted banners of Hathor, goddess of love, to cloak commerce in sanctity. But the ledgers betray the lie. The same scrolls that listed temple offerings of cattle and incense also tallied. Aegis 1220, unspoiled, fine condition, 82 head. They were marched to Thebes, to Memphis, to the sprawling compounds known as the Per-Kheneret, the House of Women. Archaeologists once believed these were schools for priestesses or musicians. Only later did excavations uncover barred chambers, narrow courtyards, and walls inscribed with inventory codes. The system was not hidden, it was institutional. The state paid for it, supplied it, taxed it. Inside, overseers, often eunuchs made so to ensure purity, recorded every detail. The women were renamed, stripped of lineage and language. Egyptian names were assigned based on function: Neferet for beauty, Hakanu for voice, Teti for childbearer. Their past was an inconvenience the state could not afford. Life in the Per-Kheneret followed the rhythm of the empire. At dawn, incense filled the corridors as attendants recited hymns to prepare the chosen for divine visitation. In reality, it was psychological warfare disguised as ritual. The women were made to fast for days, to bathe in lotus-infused water, to believe they were being purified for the gods' favor. The deprivation dulled their will. The repetition chants, silence, isolation, rewired obedience into instinct. One Ostrakhan fragment recovered near the Valley of the Queens records a woman whispering, "They teach us to smile with our eyes when our mouths can no longer lie." Some were selected for the pharaoh's nightly ceremonies, others for training to serve foreign envoys or priests. A select few were sent to temples to maintain the illusion of divine pleasure as religious offering. But for every chosen flower, dozens were discarded, branded as impure, sent to lower compounds to serve as attendants, dancers, or silent witnesses. Mortality was high disease, childbirth, suicide. Yet, in the ledgers, death was not marked as tragedy, but as statistic. The notation, "replaced within 3 cycles," appears frequently, a chilling testament to how expendable life had become under divine bureaucracy. The empire justified it all through language. In temple inscriptions, these women were called ornaments of the sun, voices of delight, servants of harmony. The euphemisms were precise, repeated across centuries to hide a horror in plain sight. The priests spoke of them as bridges between mortal and divine realms, yet even they recorded quotas. A surviving decree from the reign of Amenhotep III orders that the House of Women must supply 30 virgins per harvest for the renewal of Ra's vigor. Scholars once read that as symbolic, but papyri from the same archive list procurement costs, physician reports, and linen expenditures that correspond exactly to those numbers. Transportation itself was a nightmare. Nile barges ferried captives northward in the heat, their decks sealed under reed mats. Chroniclers estimate that 1 in 6 perished during the journey. The dead were wrapped and thrown overboard with the same indifference given to spoiled grain. In the ship manifests, the loss was written neatly, cargo reduced by 15% acceptable. That word, acceptable, echoes across centuries as the measure of how civilization can sanitize cruelty with bureaucracy. In the great cities, foreign visitors saw only the surface, the music, the painted dancers, the perfumed processions during festivals. To them, Egypt appeared radiant, sensual, divine. None knew that behind the courtyards of alabaster and lapis lay corridors where silence was law, and the penalty for speaking a true name was death. The Perkineret had no windows, only narrow slits for air, and the guards were instructed never to meet a woman's eyes. Inscriptions from Deir el-Medina mention the punishment for such contact, flogging, mutilation, and burial beneath the walls they guarded. Families who lost daughters to the system sometimes marked their surviving children with scars or burns, hoping to make them undesirable to the collectors. But desperation turned to complicity. As centuries passed, some villages offered daughters voluntarily, hoping for favor or rations. The system no longer required conquest, fear and hunger sustained it. What began as forced abduction evolved into a cultural reflex, a self-sustaining cycle of subjugation masquerading as devotion. The pharaoh's hidden harems were not dens of pleasure. They were engines of control, political, sexual, spiritual. Every chamber, every ritual, every silence served a purpose, to remind all within the empire that even the most intimate aspects of existence belonged to the throne. What happened inside the Perkineret was only the beginning. Beyond those sealed doors, the pharaoh's dominion extended into the psyche itself. The harem was not merely a collection of captives. It was an experiment in obedience, a system engineered to erase individuality so thoroughly that even memory became property of the state. Each woman's life was measured by her utility to the divine household. Physicians were ordered to maintain fertility cycles like agricultural schedules. Surviving papyri from the reign of Ramses II list expected conception rates by month, as if cataloging livestock. The phrases are coldly methodical: 3 wombs in bloom, 2 dormant, 1 spoiled. The empire tracked them not by name but by outcome, ensuring that the bloodline of divinity never depended upon the randomness of love. It was a system of biological accounting. To maintain secrecy, the pharaoh's architects designed entire substructures for isolation. Chambers were stacked like tombs, each accessible only by narrow corridors guarded by mutilated sentinels. Many were eunuchs, slaves surgically altered to prevent temptation and ensure silence. The medical instruments found in nearby tombs, long thought ceremonial, show evidence of sterilization and crude surgery. The empire had mechanized desire, turning it into a science of mutilation and ritual obedience. Contemporary accounts from visiting scribes hint at the indoctrination of children born inside the harems. They were told their mothers were divine vessels, their births part of cosmic design. Boys were removed at the age of 5 to be raised as temple attendants. Girls remained, inheriting their mother's silence. Entire generations grew up believing the walls that confined them were sacred. In this way, the system perpetuated itself, through myth, isolation, and fear. The economic dimension was equally deliberate. Temple treasuries funded the harems through taxes levied on grain and gold. Merchants profited by supplying perfumes, fabrics, and jewelry used in the pharaoh's private rituals. Even artisans benefited. The sculptors who carved miniature figures of the divine maidens sold their replicas at festivals, turning captivity into commerce. The entire society, knowingly or not, participated. To question the system was to question the god-king himself. When foreign envoys arrived in Egypt, they were offered glimpses of the harem's outer court, a spectacle carefully orchestrated to project wealth and sanctity. Musicians played, dancers moved in unison, and the pharaoh's favorites were displayed like celestial beings. Yet these performances hid the machinery of pain beneath layers of ritual. A papyrus from the archives of Akhenaten describes how foreign ambassadors were allowed to witness the fragrance of the divine household, while their own daughters, taken as tribute, vanished into its labyrinth. Punishment within the harem was swift and absolute. Any hint of defiance, an unguarded word, a forbidden glance was recorded as blasphemy. The condemned were not executed publicly. Instead, they were erased, their names chiseled out of walls, their images defaced, their bodies buried beneath fresh plaster so that new murals could be painted over their graves. One excavated fresco in the tomb of a royal steward shows a woman's silhouette faintly visible beneath the surface, her features scraped away, her outline left like a ghost imprisoned in pigment. The system's genius lay in its euphemisms. The records speak of corrections, purifications, replacements. But each term concealed violence. When a favored concubine became pregnant without authorization, the birth was recorded as a ritual offering, the infant catalogued among temple sacrifices. The state's priests preserved these entries with chilling precision. They were not ashamed, they were accountants of piety. Archaeological evidence confirms that the harem served political functions as well. High-ranking officials often placed their daughters within them to secure influence, while rivals' families lived in constant dread that proximity to the pharaoh could mean both power and annihilation. Entire dynasties rose and fell on the rumors of harem intrigues. Poisonings, betrayals, and disappearances became routine. In one recorded scandal during the late New Kingdom, a group of concubines conspired with guards to assassinate the pharaoh. Their plot failed, and every participant, women, guards, even scribes who copied their names, was executed. Their bodies were burned, their ashes mixed into mortar for the harem walls. The symbolism was clear. Defiance would literally strengthen the foundations of obedience. For the women who survived, identity dissolved slowly. Their old languages faded, their memories blurred into ritual repetition. When one of them died, her jewelry was stripped, her linen rewashed, her chamber reassigned. Life continued as if she had never existed. The empire had perfected the art of erasure. And yet, hints of rebellion surface even in the dust. In 2012, archaeologists studying a limestone shard from a workers' village near Luxor discovered a short inscription. She sang so the gods might hear her name again. It is all that remains of one woman's defiance, a melody carved into stone to outlast her silence. By the late dynasties, the system had become self-justifying. Priests claimed that the pharaoh's vitality ensured the flooding of the Nile, and that the women's submission was a sacred duty to sustain the cosmos. Generations believed this myth. Mothers taught daughters that to be chosen was an honor, even as their eyes revealed the truth. When famine struck, families offered their children willingly, trading bodies for bread. The state no longer needed soldiers to fill the harems. Hunger and faith did the work. And so the institution endured, an invisible pillar beneath Egypt's golden age. It endured through reforms, through invasions, through the rise and fall of dynasties. Each ruler inherited not just the throne, but the machinery of secrecy and desire that came with it. Even the conquerors who toppled the pharaohs adopted versions of it, understanding that controlling pleasure meant controlling people. Pause and consider. The empire that built the pyramids, that charted the stars, that wrote the first hymns to eternity, also perfected the bureaucratic enslavement of the human soul. Its monuments survive as symbols of grandeur, but beneath their beauty lies a hidden architecture of obedience. Every column, every inscription, every painting of a smiling goddess conceals the cries of those who were silenced in her name. In the end, the pharaoh's harems were not built to serve desire. They were built to annihilate it, to transform intimacy into a weapon of power, to ensure that even love could not exist without permission from the divine. That was the truest secret of the hidden harems. They were less about pleasure than about fear, less about indulgence than about absolute control. By the time Egypt entered its later dynasties, the Percanaret had ceased to be merely a palace secret. It had evolved into an invisible institution that shaped the empire's entire social order. The pharaoh's divine household had become a symbol of both majesty and menace, a sanctified mechanism that drew its strength not from love, but from submission. The system endured because it learned to disguise its cruelty as holiness. Every element of Egyptian life was connected to it. Taxes on barley, gold, and livestock supported its upkeep. Military campaigns listed captured women as tribute to the sun. Even the priesthood depended on it, for the pharaoh's virility was equated with the vitality of the gods themselves. If he failed to demonstrate divine potency, the Nile might refuse to flood, crops would wither, and cosmic balance, Ma'at, would falter. Thus, the suffering of thousands became the ritual fuel for an empire's illusion of order. Within the harems, the old methods of selection and obedience had grown into something far more insidious: reproduction as state policy. The pharaoh's bloodline was sacred, and to preserve it required careful calculation. Women were paired according to astrological charts, their fertility cycles matched with ritual calendars. Midwives and priests worked side by side, timing conception to coincide with holy festivals. Children born on auspicious days were proclaimed sons of Ra. Those born on inauspicious nights vanished without ceremony. Papyri recovered from Thebes reveal chilling precision. One fragment from the reign of Seti II records a calculation of replacement. For every 100 concubines, at least 10 were expected to conceive, while 20 were replaced each season due to illness or death. The note beside the total reads simply, "Efficiency satisfactory." These were not love affairs, they were audits. The breeding programs were overseen by a council of priests known as the Keepers of Balance. They justified their work as maintaining cosmic harmony, yet their ledgers read like engineering manuals: blood ratios, lineage purity, maternal mortality. In some cases, newborns deemed defective were smothered at birth, their deaths recorded as "return to the divine waters." The same hands that wrote hymns to life also tallied its erasures. Outside the palace, the myth of divine union was used to pacify the populace. Annual festivals reenacted the pharaoh's sacred marriage to the goddess Hathor, complete with music and mock rituals. The people believed these performances ensured fertility across the land. They did not know that within the palace walls, real women bled to make the myth believable. Psychological manipulation was woven into every layer. The women were taught that to resist was to invite the gods' wrath, that pain was purification and silence salvation. Many came to believe it. Archaeologists have found amulets inscribed with prayers begging for continued service, even after death. One reads, "May my body never tire in the house of light." Whether it was devotion or despair, the result was the same: submission internalized. The cruelty extended beyond the harem. Soldiers guarding the compounds were subjected to oaths that bound them in terror. They swore not only to protect the pharaoh's property, but to erase all memory of what they saw. One broken tablet from the tomb of an overseer reads, "If I speak of what the eye has seen, may my tongue rot in sand." The empire had perfected the art of fear, not through open violence, but through the threat of divine punishment. And when punishment came, it was staged as spectacle. Executions within the harems were never public, but the aftermath was always known. During purification festivals, censers filled with perfumed smoke were carried through the streets of Thebes. The priests announced that impurities have been burned away. The citizens rejoiced, never realizing that the fragrance masked the cremation of the condemned. Foreign chroniclers, especially those from later Persian and Greek occupations, spoke in awe of Egypt's hidden chambers of delight, but their fascination only deepened the lie. They recorded tales of exotic dances and divine pleasure, while ignoring the bureaucratic machinery that sustained it. Even when Herodotus described the secrecy of the pharaoh's court, he dismissed the darker rumors as superstition. History itself conspired to protect the illusion. The machinery persisted because it benefited everyone in power. The priests gained prestige, the soldiers gained privilege, the merchants gained contracts, and the pharaoh gained immortality, at least in image. To dismantle it would have meant admitting that Egypt's divine order rested on the suffering of its own daughters. And no ruler could survive that revelation. Pause for a moment and imagine the scale. Generations born and buried within the same walls. Women whose voices never echoed beyond limestone corridors. Children raised to forget their mothers' faces. All catalogued in ledgers written on papyrus that still survives, proof that the most advanced civilization of its age measured holiness in units of human obedience. The hieroglyphs of the Harems tell a story few wish to translate. The symbols for love and ownership are nearly identical, only the context reveals which meaning was intended. For the pharaohs, they meant the same thing. The deeper one peers into the machinery of the pharaoh's hidden harems, the clearer it becomes that cruelty had become a language, refined, elegant, and spoken fluently by those who called themselves civilized. The system did not merely survive through violence, it evolved through ritual, justification, and the seduction of order. It was no longer the lash that kept the women silent. It was belief. From birth, they were told they were chosen. To serve the divine was to ascend beyond the mortal world. Pain was not punishment, it was purification. Inscriptions in gold leaf hieroglyphs lined the inner walls. In service, there is eternity. To an outsider, these words might sound poetic. But to those trapped within, they were commandments, psychological chains gilded with devotion. Over time, the empire discovered that fear alone was inefficient. Faith, however, was eternal. The priests began teaching that the women of the Perkanere carried fragments of the god's essence. To disobey an overseer was to betray the cosmos itself. Every breath became a prayer, every touch a ritual act of survival. The system had found the perfect paradox: enslavement disguised as sanctity. Even the instruments of control were sanctified. Branding irons became seals of holiness. The guards' oaths of silence were rewritten as vows of purity. The bureaucracy of abuse had achieved divine legitimacy, and once sanctified, it could no longer be questioned. No rebellion could take root when the chains were believed to be gifts from heaven. Inside these chambers, intimacy became spectacle. The pharaoh, declared the living god Horus, performed nightly rituals witnessed by high priests and court scribes. The acts were recorded as cosmic events, the joining of flesh described as the renewal of creation itself. It was propaganda of the body, broadcast not through words, but through ritual repetition. The same ceremonies were mimicked across the empire, in temples and shrines, where dancers reenacted the union of heaven and earth. The people rejoiced, never realizing that what they celebrated was the codified suffering of their sisters. The empire even turned death into theater. When a favored concubine died, her body was treated as a relic. Her organs were removed, her flesh anointed with oils, her face covered with a mask of beaten gold. The priests told the people that she had ascended to become one with Hathor. But the ledgers tell a colder truth. These mummifications were also experiments. Attempts to preserve the pharaoh's bloodline through posthumous rituals, a grotesque merging of religion and early biology. Archaeologists examining the royal tombs have found miniature coffins containing the remains of infants, mummified fetuses buried alongside queens and concubines. For centuries, scholars believed these were symbolic offerings. But modern examinations suggest they were the children of the harems, stillborn or killed, to preserve the illusion of divine perfection. Their tiny hands remained clenched, as if reaching for lives they were never allowed to live. Outside, the myth of divine harmony persisted. Every spring, the festival of the valley drew thousands to the banks of the Nile. Priests carried effigies of the pharaoh and his wives of the sun across the water, declaring that their union sustained the world's balance. The river glistened with offerings, flowers, incense, wine, while beneath the palace floors, real blood stained the stones. The contrast was exquisite, paradise above, torment below. But perhaps the most chilling achievement of the system was its ability to erase guilt. The officials who managed the harems did not see themselves as monsters. They were administrators, servants of order. One overseer's diary fragment reads, "The king's peace depends on our precision." Precision. What a word to describe torment. The more efficiently the suffering was catalogued, the more righteous it seemed. The empire had turned empathy into heresy and obedience into virtue. Even when the system began to decay, when foreign powers invaded and Egypt's gods faltered, it did not die. The conquerors merely repurposed it. Persians, Greeks, and later Romans inherited its logic that sexuality could be statecraft, that pleasure and punishment were tools of governance. The harems changed names, the rituals took new forms, but the core remained. The commodification of intimacy, the weaponization of desire. One might imagine that such cruelty would have left no survivors to remember it. Yet fragments endure, not in royal archives, but in whispers carved by trembling hands. In a burial shaft near Saqqara, a single limestone fragment bears a woman's plea written in hieratic script, "May the gods forget my service." It is a prayer for oblivion, a request to be erased from the very divinity that enslaved her. The archaeologists who found it called it the petition of the unknown. That plea echoes across centuries, haunting even our age, because what Egypt perfected was not merely physical control, it was the architecture of silence. And that architecture endures in every society that learns to mask exploitation behind the language of divinity, duty, or progress. The pharaohs' harems were not aberrations of history. They were the blueprint for how power sustains itself through sanctified cruelty. When humanity learned to turn desire into currency and faith into chains, the seed of every later atrocity was sown. So pause again, and imagine the torchlight flickering against the limestone walls. Imagine the chants rising, the perfumed smoke twisting through the air, the sound of styluses scratching papyrus as scribes record another night's ceremony. Everything in perfect order, everything written down. And somewhere in that perfection, a single voice praying that the gods never hear her name again. The ruins of Egypt still rise like the bones of a god, half buried in sand. Tourists walk beneath the pillars of Karnak and Luxor, awed by their scale, whispering about immortality and mystery. But beneath those stones, beneath the hieroglyphs that sing praises to eternal order, lies the silence of the enslaved. The Per-Kenare left no monuments to itself, only the faint impressions of chains on limestone floors, the soot of lamps long extinguished, and the empty rooms where women once waited for the sound of approaching footsteps. It is easy to forget that civilization's brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. The same empire that built monuments to eternity also perfected the bureaucracy of subjugation. The pharaohs taught the world how to cloak cruelty in ritual, how to make faith serve power, how to turn intimacy into an instrument of the state. Every later empire, from Babylon to Byzantium, would inherit that lesson, refining it, disguising it, modernizing it. The faces changed, the languages changed, but the logic endured. Archaeologists call what remains administrative debris, ledgers, jars of cosmetics, fragments of linen, mummified infants too small to have names. But together, they tell a story more enduring than any dynasty, a story of how power survives by erasing the human cost of its own existence. The women of the pharaohs' hidden harems were written out of history so completely that we almost forgot they ever lived. Almost. And yet, traces of them persist in the myths of holy brides and divine virgins, in the architecture of secrecy that still governs palaces and parliaments alike, in the unspoken understanding that control is most absolute when it is invisible. The system that began in the shadows of Thebes never truly died. It simply changed its name. What makes their suffering unbearable is not only what was done to them, but how easily their torment was rationalized, by priests, by scribes, by society itself. It forces us to ask, how many of our own systems still operate on the same quiet logic? How much cruelty have we rebranded as order, as faith, as progress? The archives endure, papyri brittle as ash yet defiant in their existence. ledgers of misery preserved with tack scroll precision, awaiting those brave enough to read. And when we do, we reclaim those lost voices, if only for a moment. Because remembrance is rebellion. To speak their truth aloud is to strip eternity of its lies. If this history stirs something in you, if it unsettles, enrages, or compels you, subscribe and tell us where it struck deepest. We will continue this journey into the buried corners of civilization together until every shadow has a name again.